Welcome to Securing America with me, Frank Gaffney, the program that's a kind of owner's manual for protecting the country we love against all enemies, foreign and domestic, to God's glory and that of his kingdom. I'm thrilled to have with us a regular here at Securing America. His name is Robert Charles. He has served in a number of important capacities in the course of a distinguished career of government service, both in the executive branch, most recently as an Assistant Secretary of State for narcotics and law enforcement affairs. He has served in the Congress. He has served in the judicial branch as well. So who better to talk with about matters involving all branches of our government, in fact, the future of our country as well. Robert Charles, it's good to have you back. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Frank. It's always good to be with you.
You have experience, as I say, serving in the appellate court, as I recall, and I'm anxious to get your thoughts on the confirmation that took place in the course of the day today of Judge Katanya Brown Jackson, and what you make of her record, what you think of her judgment, her judicial temperament, and the impact she's likely to have on not just the Supreme Court, but on our country more generally.
Yeah, so Frank, it's a great question at a great time. You know, we're at a sobering moment in the history of the country. You talk about it often, and there's nothing more emblematic, in my view, than the people that this administration would seek to put on the courts of the United States, not just the Supreme Court, but the U.S. Court of Appeals. I clerked for a Judge Reagan appointee on the Ninth Circuit, U.S. Court of Appeals. The Ninth Circuit was already headed left at that time, but and the district court level. So it's sobering for several reasons. First, I think what we can anticipate, it's a hard left turn. It's not just a left turn; it's a hard left turn, and the result is that.
Now you say that even though we're told that she's just replacing another man of the left, Justice Stephen Breyer.
Stephen Breyer.
Why do you say hard left, and will that make a difference? Do you think?
Well, Stephen Breyer was someone who got along with others on the bench, wouldn't have put out what I would call a screaming dissent. Sotomayor has put out some screaming dissents, but I think the difficulty I have with this candidate, if you were to reduce it to a few basic comments that she made during an extended period of hearings that really resurfaced again and again reasons why she really doesn't belong on the high court, but nevertheless, obviously, will get confirmed. So the reason, that I find it so troubling is when she was asked to define a woman, she couldn't do that. And so there's something immediate in that, but there's something also deeper in that failure. On the one hand, you can say, well, she's acting woke or politically correct, and we're redefining. I think there are now 64 different genders that the left would like us to believe exist. And we're telling girls, I have a daughter, we're telling girls that Title IX doesn't matter anymore, that they must compete against boys and lose if that's the physiology of that process. So there's a gutting of the entire, what I would call empowerment of women that has occurred over the last 40, 50 years. And ironically, the Republicans now become the great defenders of Title IX and the great defenders of what it means to be a man and a woman, a girl and a boy. That you could not define that, or were not willing to, in an environment where you are female and you're sitting in front of the United States Congress, the Senate. To me, it was stunning. But what it really does, Frank, is it tells us that if you can redefine or undefine a word like that in the American lexicon, then there's not a single word in the United States Constitution that you would not be willing to redefine. And that is the great terror, or the great concern that I have about putting someone on the bench that is essentially a political actor rather than a judicial actor. And I'll just end with this. People say, well, politics has interfered with the court. And certainly all of these actors were anybody who sits on the court is a well-informed person. And although many of them literally do not read newspapers today, they did at one point. But there's a very big difference between a judicial conservative and a political conservative. A judicial conservative is a textualist. There's someone who goes back to the meaning of the Constitution, deep, maybe sometimes all the way back to the Magna Carta, to understand the meaning of words as they should be, so that they can apply that phrase, that promise, that right, that procedure to a set of facts, a case or controversy, which has come before them in that moment. That's a very conservative way to look at the court. It doesn't actually, to look at the law, it doesn't actually mean that you come out on a politically conservative side all the time. It means that you are very, very respectful of the founders and all of the effort and the depth that went into the creation of our Constitution and Bill of Rights. The notion that you should come along willy-nilly on the left and be an activist on the court, pretend that you're a legislator, decide that you can redefine words at the drop of a hat, that is actually not typically the job of a judge. That is, there are cases of first impression, but they're very rare. And so the point here is, I am concerned that it represents a very likely turn to the left, and also I think it also signals to us that they will continue to try to undermine the legitimacy of this court, and potentially pack it before January of next year with new justices to make it political. And it's very disturbing, because Roe v. Wade may well be reversed this year. Second Amendment rights may well be reaffirmed. And, I work with AMAC. I'm a national spokesman for AMAC, sort of the legacy of Ronald Reagan. For whom
that is, of course, the Association for Mature American Citizens.
Exactly.
We had its CEO, Rebecca Weber, on recently.
Exactly. And Rebecca's fantastic. And the organization is one I would encourage everyone to join. But the point is, you and I both worked for Ronald Reagan. It inherits a lot of it is the spokesperson, if you will, for a lot of the values that he represented. And this justice is the exact opposite of those values.
Let me drill down just a moment on that, because I think what you've described, which is very troubling, is this sort of sense that the Constitution is a living document and it can be reinterpreted at will. It can be ignored, for that matter, if that suits the political agenda of an individual who is first and foremost, I think it's fair to say, a political activist, as you've put it. Talk, if you would, because you've been inside these chambers, not the Supreme Court, perhaps, but, one of the other very, very high courts of the land. You've seen how important collegiality is, how much the impact of personalities can shape consensus positions, or perhaps majority positions at least. How would you anticipate someone with the predilections and priorities of Katinya Brown Jackson would have an outsized impact, perhaps not just on the minority that is left in the court today, but perhaps the majority as well, and certainly a future majority?
You'd like to hope, Frank, that institutions tend to modify people or cause them to become more collegial. We're certainly not seeing that in the Senate or the House or any of the other institutions. I'm reminded that Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was a professor at Columbia just before I was there, who later served on the court, and Justice Scalia were actually very good friends. And that level of collegiality in that institution has been sort of a hallmark. At the same time, the things that are being said, that she has written and said, are very stark. They're not of a kind that, in order for you and I to come to common understanding of something, we have to start with assumptions and presumptions, and we have to start with a deep respect for the Constitution and its founders and its founding meaning and the circumstances which surrounded that meaning. So on the one hand, it's always good to have fresh blood on the court. That's a good thing, actually not a bad thing. But in the grand scheme of things, this justice looks to me like someone who is more devoted to a political ideology than to the notion of learning from, I'm prejudging a little here, but learning from her peers and understanding the magnitude of what it means to revere the Constitution.
Robert, hold that thought. We're going to come back momentarily with more with former Assistant Secretary of State Robert Charles. We're going to talk about the executive branch next, specifically the challenge posed by, the deep compromise of its senior leadership by our enemy, the Chinese Communist Party. That and more right after this. Welcome back. We're visiting with a very distinguished former naval officer, a former White House official under Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush, a former Assistant Secretary of State, a former clerk in the Ninth Circuit of the Court of the Appeals of the United States, among many other things. These days, he is a spokesman for AMAC, the Association of Mature American Citizens. We're always delighted to catch up with Robert Charles. Um, we talked a bit about the judicial branch and this rather momentous development in our previous conversation. Robert, let's turn to the executive. You've served in it with distinction. You've got a military background. You understand national security and have practiced it intimately. What do you make of what we have learned to date? And it seems as though with each passing day, we're learning more and more from Hunter Biden's laptop about the compromise, not just of Hunter Biden, not just of the first family, but of the President of the United States himself, by arguably the greatest enemy we've ever faced, the Chinese Communist Party, apparently among others.
So I think let me sort of in a concentric circle start big and work to the center. um, a simple observation that most Americans should sort of bring to heart, whether you're left or right or anything, is that there would be no scandal around this Hunter Biden laptop if there were no Joe Biden. Joe Biden is the hub of well, what maybe a prosecutor would broadly call a complicit or conspiratorial turn of events. So you have to have someone who has influence being sold in order to have sold influence, and so that's the big picture. And where that leads, one doesn't know. What we now see, sort of coming in that circle, is the likelihood of indictments begins to grow broadly, both because of domestic behavior or personal behavior that seems to be on that laptop, and because of the potential for national security compromise also involved in that laptop. The third thing I'll say is that this is
But
really.
is there any question in your mind that there has been national security
So I
compromise
haven't seen this
based on
laptop,
what
but
we've seen?
I read all the open source information that I can on it. I have no special channel into the prosecutor's office at all. But what I interpret is that you have a series of events that we all know about that brought this son of a vice president at the time to China, where he cut deals that involved millions, tens of millions of dollars, and then did the same thing in Ukraine. And that the president, now current president, that vice president, was obviously aware of these things. He traveled with him. The notion that there were no conversations about what his son was doing in these countries is a bit untenable. So the question becomes, and this is really something going on inside the FBI, I think, and inside the national security community, is exactly what level of compromise might have been involved. I don't have the answer to that question, but you have to ask that question, and you have to know that if there was compromise of that kind, it involves the man who's currently in the Oval Office.
And
The
Bobby,
last,
I ask each of our guests this question, and I'll put it to you very bluntly. If this were anybody else other than the President of the United States, with this kind of, well, record now being made ever more public, is there any question in your mind that the recourse of the government would be to remove that person from office and probably prosecute them to the fullest extent of the law?
I think we have to just look at empirical examples to get to the answer to that question, Frank. And the answer is, if you had, as we did, people who were tied to the Chinese government in one way or another, not necessarily from China, in our national labs, they were immediately removed and many of them were prosecuted. If you had a member of Congress or someone who was within some other executive appointed position, that would be a real problem. Look, this is a very difficult situation, and I am sure that prosecutors, rather than indicting without the full case, are looking to make the full case when it comes to whether it's the Biden family or those around Hunter Biden or anyone else. And I have no idea what they will come up with. But I will say the problem percolates enough, Frank, that I am hearing from, ear on the rail, that people who have never, that this could become very serious. And the last thing I just want to add is that the media, and this has to be said, Frank, the media was complicit in this. These facts were well known in the 2020 cycle. And the notion that this was a spiked story that somehow now is being revitalized, and they say, oh, well, it looks like it was credible. Look, all of these facts that relate to what was available were available then. And I think you do have to ask the question, did the media, therefore, by being complicit in spiking this story for the American public, except for folks like the New York Post, did they contribute to a change in the election?
No question about it. We're going to talk more about all of this with you, Bobby, in the days ahead, I'm sure, as more information comes out about this laptop, and hopefully there is evidence coming out as well that it is being seriously investigated and hopefully prosecuted. Let me turn quickly to one last subject that I know is near and dear to your heart, having served, among other things, with law enforcement agencies around the world, about the border. We now have a full on invasion of our country. I don't think there's any other word to describe it. 3 million people in the last year alone. We're looking at that number being greatly increased as a result of something called Title 42 being waived at the end of next month. Give us your sense of both the stakes involved in allowing this problem to continue to metastasize, and frankly, I guess how much damage has already been done by the Biden administration as a matter of policy on the border.
Yeah. So to unpack that quickly, Title 42, which is a law that came into existence in 1944, gives the president the authority to block and return people from crossing our border illegally if they have a communicable or may have a communicable disease. And the four countries that are the largest illegal crossers into this country actually are countries that have had roughly a third of their people inoculated and have in January had a massive spike in COVID. That's independent, by the way, of things like hepatitis and typhoid and syphilis and tuberculosis, which is very big in the region. So the point is, Title 42 ought to always be available, and it certainly shouldn't be waived in May, which is what this president is saying he's going to do. What are the stakes? The stakes are that you will flood again, sort of elevate, perhaps even double the number of people flooding the heartland who are potentially carrying this communicable disease. That's independent of the illegality of the crossing. We had a fairly orderly process, frankly, up through every president to ending with Trump. And that orderly process was that there was a room for seeking asylum if you were individually likely to be persecuted in your country for a variety of reasons. So you had a well-founded fear of persecution. All of these things were legally being enforced. The notion that you would take away this tool, that you would simply wipe out a tool that is being used right now on our border to protect Americans is really, Frank, it's very hard to understand unless you understand it as someone who wishes to promote the idea of illegal immigration, whether that's for some ideological reason or for voting fraud or some other reason. It just
All of
doesn't
the
make a lot
above.
of sense.
Yeah, and let me just ask you again quickly. We've got less than a minute, Robert. When you look at this situation and the number of military age men who are coming in this invasion, to say nothing of the Afghans who have been unvetted and who knows who all else is coming in from Ukraine, do we have reason to be concerned that this will result in violence inside our country at their hands?
Yeah, I can't point to an individual case, so let me be broad, Frank, and say yes, gang violence, drug traffickers, all the ne'er-do-wells of the world also read newspapers and blogs and websites, and they know that if you want to get into this country, whether you're a terrorist or a drug trafficker or just somebody who wants to illegally get here, that the southern border is the way to go. And we're not speaking openly about something people don't know. And so I think it's sad, and it's also very concerning because they go to the heartland.
They go all over the heartland. That's really the crux of the matter, is if this does portend violence, it will be all over our country. Robert Spencer, thank you for your service to our country, that in the past and that you are continuing to render, notably at amac.us. I hope people will follow you there. Next up, we're going to speak with Itamar Marcus of Israel about what's going on with the Palestinians and the danger that our government is inflaming that situation. We're back, and it's a delight to say we're joined by a friend and colleague of many years, a man I have regarded as a really remarkably courageous as well as highly effective freedom fighter, particularly for the cause of his native state of Israel, as well as for, I think, the interests of the free world more generally. He is Itamar Marcus. He is the founder and director of a terrific organization, Palestinian Media Watch. He, back in the day, served as a negotiator for the government of Israel with the Palestinians on an issue that he has followed intensively and I think with great effect, namely the deliberate incitement to violence that the Palestinian Authority and various other factions, of course, like Hamas, have consistently engaged in, including, not least, with our taxpayer subsidies. We're going to talk with him about all of that and more. Itamar Marcus, welcome to Securing America. It's been a long time since we've talked. I'm so glad to catch up with you.
Thank you so much for inviting me back, Frank. It's always great to be with you.
Part of the reason I'm anxious to do so, Itamar, is of course there has been a considerable uptick lately, as you know, of violence in Israel at the hands of Palestinians. And I wanted to just take stock with you. Is this a function, once again, of this practice of inciting it on the part of the so called Partners for Peace with Israel, the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas and company?
Yes, you're absolutely right that we've been actually warning about this for a number of months. Probably already in February, we released a report showing that the Palestinian Authority was definitely interested in having low scale violence. Low scale violence means not having masses of soldiers or Palestinian policemen going out shooting, but they want people to go out with their knives, individuals with guns, as well as possibly people with cars. They have a term for this. They call it popular resistance or popular uprising. Since February, we have had incessant calls for this. In fact, there was an event of the PLO where Abbas spoke, and the newspaper reported that he personally called for everyone to increase the popular resistance. And then another person talked about every speech at this event was about popular resistance. So the Palestinian Authority, because it's weak right now, because in the polls, the majority of Palestinians are sick of them because of corruption. They needed violence, and so they have been encouraging violence, encouraging what they call popular resistance. Now, with this term comes a lot of hate incitement, so that people will be motivated to be violent. So, for example, they're talking about Israel defiling the Al-Aqsa Mosque. They're talking about Israel making it difficult for them to get to the Al-Aqsa Mosque during Ramadan, constantly accusing Israel, numerous libels of every. They're talking all lately about Israel intentionally maltreating prisoners so that they get sick and that they die and there's a dying prisoner. So all of these libels are coming out to create hatred, and at the same time, he calls for this violence. So absolutely, this did not
And to be
come in a
clear,
vacuum.
yeah, it's not happening in a vacuum, and it is happening with effect. And there have been numbers of Americans, excuse me, of Israeli citizens who have been murdered with these knife wielding or other violent acts from the Palestinians. And the incitement goes down to, as you've documented extensively, Itamar Marcus, to grade school indoctrination of children, does it not?
Absolutely. We just released a report, and we're going to come out with a proper version of this report on a Fatah magazine. Fatah, again, this is the so called moderates, Fatah. And in this magazine, which is for 5 year olds, for 5 to 15 year olds, they glorify martyrdom. They tell the children that they should be participating in violence. And when children are killed in terror attacks, those children are glorified. So this is and why does the Palestinian Authority send their kids out to die? Because they know it's good for PR. When Israel is forced to shoot into a crowd of terrorists, and among them happens to be a 15-year-old, or if a 15-year-old goes with a knife and stabs an Israeli and then is shot and killed, the Palestinians scream to the world, Israel killed another 15-year-old, and they don't mention that he had just stabbed someone.
Right. And so when you look at all of this taken together, it bespeaks, obviously, well, a dishonesty at the very least, if not an actual deceptiveness on the part of the Palestinians, who we are told by, among others, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken in the so-called Negev summit a week or two ago, are actually committed to peace and are necessarily going to be the next focus of American diplomacy in the region, something that the Trump administration had abandoned, I think, quite properly, given the lack of integrity in this process that the incitement campaign makes perfectly clear. How do you see what the United States is doing at the moment in terms of trying to breathe new life into the Palestinian so-called peace process against the backdrop of this kind of conduct?
Well, there are two possibilities. One is that there's willful blindness on the part of the leadership. Uh, for some reason, American leaders have always hated the fact that there was no what they called progress toward a peace process, and they did whatever they could, usually giving incredible benefits and hundreds of millions, I should say by now billions of dollars to the Palestinian Authority in the hope that they would join a peace process, but they never have. Uh, President Trump understood better than anyone before him that the Palestinian Authority is lying, and he gave up on them and he went toward the Gulf states and he created a peace very quickly between the Gulf states and Israel. The new
By
administration.
essentially setting aside the whole idea that the focus of American diplomacy towards the Middle East in general had to be centered around the Palestinian struggle, right?
Absolutely, it was a brilliant, brilliant decision, and it was Israel and the Gulf states are going to benefit for hopefully many years to come. Not first of which is in an alliance against Iran, and hopefully afterward with all sorts of economic benefits that the two countries will have for the long term. And um, but the Palestinian
Not
Authority
not
doesn't want to
no
get
no
caught.
credit to the Biden team though, if that is the case, because in
No,
fact at
absolutely
this
not.
Negev summit, as we've been talking about on this program, every effort was made to really hijack the whole effort on the Abraham Accords and their follow-on work by inserting, by the
Look, I'll
Secretary of
just tell you
State,
something. The
Palestine as
this
the centerpiece.
Yeah, this report that we published on this Palestinian Fatah magazine for children called WAED, 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 which means the promise. Um, One of the key messages that we studied, by the way, we went back 17 magazines and we studied every message. There was never a message of living beside Israel, together with Israel. There were repeated messages over and over again that the end game is eliminating Israel, liberating what they called all of Palestine from the river to the sea. All the Jews are going to leave, just like the French left Algeria. This is Fatah Mahmoud Abbas. And by the way, anyone who funds the Palestinian Authority is funding this magazine, is
Yeah.
funding this hatred.
Well,
So,
to that point, we are supposed to not be funding certain activities of the Palestinian Authority, including, essentially subsidies for terrorism and families of terrorists, particularly if they get killed in the process. Where does that stand at the moment? Is that still ongoing? Are we still, American taxpayers, still providing funds that wind up in those kinds of
well,
activities?
one of the most important bills that was passed under the Trump administration was the Taylor Force Act. The Taylor Force Act prohibits the United States government from giving funding directly to the Palestinian Authority into their general budget. And the Biden administration is looking for ways to bypass that. Now, the only way that Taylor Force would no longer hinder the Biden administration if the Palestinian Authority would stop paying salaries to terrorists in prison, to murderers, to killers. People like Abdallah Barghouti. Just have to give you a sense of what this means. Abdallah Barghouti built the bombs that murdered 67 Israelis in suicide bombings. He is serving 67 life sentences. And since he's gone to jail, the Palestinian Authority has paid him over $270,000 in monthly salaries. $270,000. So this is
And
just
do we have
one
reason to
person.
believe that came from us?
Until the Taylor Force Act came into effect during the he was arrested in 2003. From 2003 till a couple of years ago, when the Taylor Force American money was paying the salary of this murderer, who, by the way, killed many Americans as well.
But
Um,
Itamar, are you saying that that is not the case today? That the Biden administration is honoring the Taylor Force Act, or are you saying that we're
They're
watching
trying
them sort
to
of get
bypass it a
around it?
little bit. What they're
Okay.
doing is they've been giving tens of millions of dollars to what they're calling humanitarian projects, so that they're giving the money to specific projects as opposed to giving it to the general budget. But worse than that is they're working with the Palestinian Authority to have them create some kind of fiction so that they won't be paying the salaries to the terrorists, but they actually on paper, but in fact, the salaries will be going to the Palestinians in another way. And I'll just give you one example that the Palestinians have already reported on, and that is that the Palestinians, aside from the terrorists in prison, and there are 4,500 of them, there are about 7,500 released prisoners who continue to get the high salaries. So, what's the Palestinian Authority doing? They're taking those prisoners and they're putting into government ministries and giving them fictitious jobs in the government ministries so that they won't be getting paid by the Palestinian Ministry of Prisoners. They'll be getting paid by the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Security, all these, and then they'll be
A
able to tell the
subterfuge,
Americans,
in other words.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
Itamar, we have to leave it at that. This is such an important part of the story, and the work that you do chronicling it and exposing it is invaluable. And I hope that we'll have a chance to talk with you further about it in the days ahead. Also, whether a new government in Israel might make a difference in this regard as well as others, but that's for another day. I want to thank you for joining us. Come back to us soon. We're going to talk with Kevin Freeman next about what the Biden administration has in mind for cryptocurrency. Will they do the same damage to it as to the dollar? What are the implications? Right after this. Welcome back. And again, a special welcome to our next guest. His name is Kevin Freeman. He is one of our regulars here at Securing America, I'm pleased to say. He is also the host of his own television program, Economic War Room, with Kevin Freeman. You can find it on Blaze TV, among other platforms. An absolutely superb program addressing the area of his particular specialization, economic warfare. He's the author of two best-selling books, Secret Weapon and Game Plan, and has a terrific blog, globaleconomicwarfare.com. Kevin Freeman, it's great to have you with us. Welcome back. It's my pleasure, as always, to have a chance to interact with you, Kevin, especially about topics that are really momentous, one of which is a new executive order that President Biden has just launched, talking about how the United States government is looking to proceed with respect to digital currency. Talk a little bit about what seems to be in the offing and its potential downside risks.
Well, Frank, the inputs going into that executive order and then the implications are so huge. It's hard to, I'll try and boil it down. Bottom line, when Bitcoin was created, we entered a new world of digital currencies. The question is, would the federal government or the governments around the world allow those currencies, which were a threat to their monetary control, or would they try and harness the huge technological capabilities, and use them for greater government control? And I'm afraid both are being seen. They're trying to control the digital currencies that are being developed by liberty-minded people, and at the same time, they're using this as a mechanism for absolute control over every person. It's 1984, like George Orwell never could have imagined.
Yeah, on steroids. So, talk a little bit about that second part, Kevin. There's what are, I guess, being called central bank cryptocurrencies.
CBDC, central bank digital currency.
Digital currencies, excuse me, digital currencies. What are they, and how would they work compared to how Bitcoin and other private sector cryptocurrencies have been operating?
Well, first off, they're electronic money. I mean, very few people pull cash out of their wallets to buy things anymore. You go to buy a car, you're going to sign some papers. It's all electronically transferred. You pay your bills online. So most everything has become digitally transferred. The difference is we call what they're doing programmable money. And the reason is the Fed has been very blatant in saying this. They said think about all of the wonderful possibilities of controlling the economy if you can make money good for a certain period of time, but not good after another period of time. So it shows up in your bank account and you have $10,000, but it's has an expiration date on it. It expires after June of this year. Or maybe it's not good until September because they want to control spending very tightly so that they can make our economy work the best. It is central bank planning. It is the very thing that the communists have longed for. It is what totalitarians would like to have. And it is individualized. It's not just, well, this money is good for 90 days. It could be good for you for 90 days, but good for someone else forever. Or maybe your dollars are worth only half as much, Frank, because you're of the wrong skin color as someone who has a different skin color and they're worth twice as much in their account. So you'd have an incentive to give to someone else because they could get more out of it. Or they could say, we've looked at your cholesterol because all the records are digital and online, and we can look at Frank Gaffney's cholesterol. It's a little high, and therefore you're trying to buy a steak at this restaurant. We suggest you get the tofu instead.
And your money won't pay for the steak, I think is
It
your point.
won't work.
And
Exactly.
Kevin, it's not just skin color. It could be your political orientation. It could be, the people that you associate with. It could be, in other words, integrated into that other piece of sort of super Orwellian control, the so-called social credit system that the Chinese Communist Party has not only implemented at home, but is now exporting abroad. Some of it here under the guise of digital medical cards and the like, vaccine
Vaccine
passports, if you
passports.
will.
Yes.
Yeah.
And not
No,
only
I
that,
just wanted to close this thought. To the extent that this is in prospect, how close to being actualized do you think it is?
the technology exists now. It will be introduced initially as a benefit. Everybody's going to get an extra $1,000 out to test the system. So everyone will sign up for it. It will then become mandatory at some point. The COVID game plan is showing us exactly how they do this. 2 weeks to slow the spread, and then everything shut down. But it's voluntary at first, but then it's mandatory. Same thing with the vaccines. What a wonderful thing. Get on the list. You should want to get the vaccine. And people fought to get on the list. But eventually, it's knocking on your door and saying, you didn't get vaccinated. You can't fly in an airplane. You can't get this job. You lose your job that you do have. It will start very benign and it will ramp very quickly. This could happen within 12 to 18 months.
And become extraordinarily controlling and inimical, obviously, to what's left of our freedoms. Kevin, we have about a minute left before we have to take a short break with you. Talk a little bit about an idea that you have been pursuing in Texas that might give us an alternative approach here.
Well, if I were marketing this properly, I'd say, get the founders' secret. The founders of this nation planted in the Constitution a secret weapon that you could use to fight back against this digital tyranny. And they did. Article 1, Section 10. I did an entire program on this. It's out today at economicwarroom.com. And it talks about a cryptocurrency you can trust. And it literally was created and made possible by language put in our Constitution by the founders of this nation. It is the founder's secret. It is, but we give it free. I'm not trying to hype you or sell you anything. Go to economicwarroom.com, download the economic battle plan, and it goes into great detail on how we could have a cryptocurrency that is state-based, that is privacy protections, and doesn't have implications of tax, and it's fully backed by gold and silver.
Wow. Sounds too good to be true, but I know coming from you, it is true. And it's one of the things that we prize about our partnership with you, Kevin Freeman, is you are constantly coming up with really important ideas, in this case, with an incredibly valuable sort of track record going back to the founders to provide in Texas specifically a currency alternative to what might be an instrument of mass control by the federal government. We're going to talk more about that in the days ahead for sure. Kevin, when we come back, I want to talk to you about China, another area that you focus on because it's waging economic, among other kinds of warfare against us. That and more with Kevin Freeman right after this. Welcome back. And we're continuing our really timely conversation, as always, with Kevin Freeman, the host of Economic War Room with Kevin Freeman. You were describing some problems here at home. I want to turn a bit more to the enemy outside the United States of greatest concern, namely the Chinese Communist Party. For decades, Kevin, as you know, we have been encouraged to engage with China. The basic premise being that if we made them rich, they'd be more like us and more benign, and everybody would get along and everybody would make money and so on. It hasn't worked out that way. And we've seen a growing interest, rightly so, in disengaging from China, especially to the extent we are continuing to support them, it's making them a more dangerous adversary. Talk a little bit about what steps the Chinese Communist Party is taking to make it more difficult for us to disengage from them, to keep us essentially hooked up to their supply chains.
Well, the first thing we need to realize is that 15 years ago or so, when I started talking economic warfare in the Pentagon, they weren't interested in the defensive aspect and nature of it. They were only interested primarily in the weapon that could be waged. And so I had all these meetings, including in DARPA. They said, now, couldn't this be an offensive weapon? And my point to them was,
This is the
watch out.
Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. Yeah.
Yes, and my point to them was, watch out. Our enemies have already planned the offensive weapons. This is our opportunity to prepare so that they cannot wage economic warfare against us. The intellectual property thefts, crashing stock markets, you name the different sanctions, the different types. They didn't seem interested in the defensive. Unfortunately, China and Russia absolutely were interested. They knew that that America would at some point turn economic weaponry against them, and so the Russians very calculatingly prepared to defend the ruble if we went in a full-on assault, and they planned to protect their country from a cutoff of the international payment system by building their own payment system. They planned to develop contracts and agreements to protect their energy. The Chinese did as well. And the Chinese were aware that we could maybe sanction a big firm, but if they could get so inculcated into our supply chain that it became, we could only cut them off if we were unwilling to build houses or to build computers or to manufacture medicines. And so they got their industries, well, what we see as a marketplace, and we said, oh, they're the low-cost supplier in Beijing. We should buy from them. They strategically placed industries that were critical and crucial to our economic continuance into our supply chains. And if we were to cut them off, we are essentially cutting ourselves off. And that was beautiful planning. They call it the Little Giants program. It's been written about recently. You sent me an article on it this morning. It's genius for their defensive protection against our economic warfare. And you can see, back to the Russian ruble example, the ruble has come all the way back to its pre-war levels before we started attacking it so sharply. The Chinese are so ingrained in our economy. It is going to take a warlike effort, a mobilization effort to remove the vulnerabilities of our economy from China.
Yeah, war footing, as they say, is what's needed, I think. And Kevin, one of the things that we've been partnering with you on in connection with our committee on the present danger China is trying at a bare minimum to stop the practice of having American financiers pouring the money that many of us give them, pension funds and 401k plans and mutual funds and exchange traded funds, among other things, to invest for us, pouring that money into the Chinese Communist Party, its front companies, even some working for the People's Liberation Army itself. Talk a little bit about some work that you've been doing that's an important part of what we call our Mad as Hell campaign at the Committee on the Present Danger China. And people can learn more about all of this at presentdangerchina.org. Tell us
Well,
specifically about what you're doing on the training up of financial managers.
as is true with the Little Giants and how they've gotten into our economic system, they've gotten into Wall Street. And so every major index fund, pension fund, and so forth, has Chinese exposure of one type or another. Can you imagine? It is December 8th, 1941. And in Congress, there's a debate. No, 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 we can't defend our homeland because, I've got a lot of Japanese companies in my portfolio. And Hitler's bad, but Daimler-Benz is really good. And I want to hold on to that because it's making me money. That is almost the situation we find ourselves in today. We are at war in a sense. It's an economic war. And people are arguing, well, we can't be tough on China because that might hurt my portfolio. Well, we had this campaign to get out of the thrift savings plan of the United States, this intention to put a huge percentage of money into the Chinese market where our servicemen and women, soldiers on the front lines, would be building and financing the weapons that might be aimed back at them. Well, the average American is now financing the economic weapons aimed back at them because they're investing so heavily in China. Wall Street is woke, and we are training financial advisors for clients who say, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore, like in that movie Network, screaming out the window, I want my money out of China. Well, the advisor doesn't know how to do it, so we're training financial advisors. Our training course is online at Liberty University. We've got a new training facility. You just saw it. You were here last weekend where we're going to be on ground training. We want to help financial advisors help their clients weaponize their money for the good of America, not for its destruction, for their future portfolios and not for their future slavery.
Yeah. Well, you've taught me so much about the kind of warfare that the Chinese are waging. Unfortunately, economic warfare is only one part of it. As you know, unrestricted warfare is a broader portfolio, if you will, of threats against our country. But what you're doing, Kevin, with this National Security Consultants Institute, I think is Investment Consultants Institute, is so critically important. And I hope people will check it out at your website, economicwarroom.com. Thank you for your leadership in all of these areas and for your contributions to this program. We'll look forward to talking with you again next week, Kevin Freeman. Well, thank you for joining us for this edition of Securing America. I hope, as always, that you feel better equipped to do just that. And for more information about how you can, please check out securingamerica.tv. Follow me at Frank Gaffney on all the platforms, and then go forth and multiply.